Hi there, I'm Anissa, and for 16 years I lived in peace, until the night my parents broke into my home, shattering everything I thought was behind me. I thought cutting ties would protect me, but instead, it opened a door I never wanted to face again. What would drive a family to invade the life you built without them? Before we dive in, have you ever had to choose between family and your own peace? Let me know in the comments. The rain was falling in soft, steady sheets when I pulled into the driveway that evening. Portland's late autumn had a way of feeling heavier than just cold air. There was something about the way the clouds pressed down that made everything smaller, quieter. I turned off the engine and sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary, savoring the quiet hum of the heater before stepping back into my world. I had lived alone and at peace for 16 years. I had built this life from the wreckage of my childhood with my own two hands. The apartment building I owned wasn't much by city standards. Modest, clean, full of tenants who paid on time and minded their business. But it was mine. Every key, every lease, every late-night repair call was proof I had survived. Proof I had won. When I finally opened the door, a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the weather. The hallway lights were on. The faint smell of old perfume, my mother's signature blend of lavender and powder, hung in the air like a warning. The front door had been locked when I left. I was sure of it. My heart hammered as I crept forward. And there, in my living room, as if no time had passed at all, stood Darlene and Leonard Parks, my parents. They looked older, of course, more worn at the edges. But the way they held themselves, the way they looked at me, hadn't changed. Not an ounce of guilt, not a flicker of hesitation, just pure, unfiltered entitlement. "You think you can ignore your family forever?" my mother snapped, as if we were picking up an old argument right where we had left off. "You owe us, Anissa. Blood is blood." I couldn't find my voice. My hands shook at my sides, nails biting into my palms. Memories flooded back, a deluge of locked doors, shouted insults, bruises hidden under long sleeves. I had escaped all of it, or so I thought. Leonard crossed his arms, surveying the room with thinly veiled disdain, as if already calculating what he might claim for himself. "You wouldn't have this if it weren't for us," he muttered. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. I only remember the pounding in my ears and the rising tide of something hotter than fear, rage. I forced myself to move. My voice, when it came, was cold enough to crack the air. "Get out." They didn't argue. Darlene just sniffed and grabbed her coat, Leonard muttering under his breath. But the way they walked out, slow and deliberate, told me this wasn't over. I bolted the door behind them, threw the deadbolt, checked the windows twice. It wasn't until I leaned back against the door and slid to the floor that the shaking started. The next morning, when I stepped outside, the world looked deceptively normal. Cars passed by. A dog barked somewhere down the block. The bakery on the corner had its usual line of early risers, and taped to my front door, fluttering slightly in the breeze, was a note. "You're still blood. You owe us." 5 words, written in the same tight, slanted handwriting I remembered from the scrawled chore lists she used to leave for me on the fridge. I stared at the note, my pulse pounding in my throat. For a long time, I didn't move. I didn't have to touch it to feel the weight of it. Every letter was a chain linked back to every apology I never received, every cry for help that had been ignored, every moment I had realized that love in my family had always come with a ledger. Inside, I sat on the edge of my couch, the note still clutched in my hand. I didn't realize I was rocking slightly until the movement made the coffee on the table ripple. I had thought the worst was over when I locked them out. I didn't know it was just beginning. The rain had stopped the next morning, leaving behind a world that felt washed out and heavy, like an overexposed photograph. I spent hours cleaning the apartment, not because it needed it, but because I needed something to anchor myself. The rhythmic motion of wiping down counters, vacuuming the same spots twice, folding towels with crisp, unnecessary precision. It gave my shaking hands something to do. I kept telling myself things were settling again, that the note, the break-in, the confrontation, they were isolated moments. Maybe I could seal them off like bad plumbing, patch over the damage, move forward. I had almost convinced myself when the letter arrived. It was folded neatly, tucked inside an official-looking envelope. No different from the mundane notices that came with running a business. At first, I opened it with the detached caution I gave to bills and property assessments. Then I read the first line. According to our records, your application for senior benefits has been approved pending final verification. My stomach twisted. I flipped through the pages, scanning words that blurred together. Name, address, social security number, mine, all mine. But I had never filed for anything. The world tilted slightly. I stumbled to the couch and sat down hard, clutching the letter in both hands. For a second, I thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe some clerical error, a crossed wire in the vast impersonal system. But deep down, I knew. It was her. It was always her. My mother had stolen my identity, not to escape danger, not to survive, but to siphon whatever scraps she could from the life she refused to believe wasn't hers to claim. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was an invasion more intimate than breaking down my door. She had reached inside the shell I had built, cracked it open, and scribbled her name across my future. I called my lawyer with hands that shook so badly I dropped the phone twice. He listened quietly as I read the letter aloud, his silence punctuated only by the soft tapping of keys as he took notes. "This complicates things," he said finally. "Her actions are criminal. We need to move fast before she buries you deeper." The word criminal sat heavy in my chest. I hung up, the sound of the call ending ringing louder than it should have in the empty room. Later that night, after hours of staring blankly at TV shows I couldn't follow, I found myself at my laptop. The government's identity theft reporting site glowed in the dark room, cursor blinking patiently in the first form field. Name, Anissa Tate. Age, 35. Victim. Yes. I hovered over the submit button, my finger trembling in midair. Reporting her would mean more than legal action. It would mean crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. It would mean giving up any lingering fantasy that this family could be repaired, that blood meant anything other than a convenient weapon. I remembered the words drilled into me as a child, recited like gospel in our house. Family is everything. Blood never betrays blood. But here I was, betrayed in ways even my childhood hadn't prepared me for. Betrayed by the very people who had once told me my scars were proof of their love. How many times could you lose the same people? How many pieces of yourself could you lose before there was nothing left? The clock on the wall ticked loud in the silence, marking time I could never get back. I wasn't sure if I was about to lose my parents again, or finally lose the last pieces of myself they hadn't already stolen. The gray hung low over Portland that week, pressing against the windows with a persistent, aching chill. I buried myself in work, checking leases, answering tenant emails, reviewing maintenance requests, telling myself that if I kept moving, the cracks would stop widening. It was late afternoon when I checked the mailbox, expecting more forms from the attorney or yet another municipal notice. Instead, a thick cream-colored envelope sat there, its gold-embossed edges practically screaming celebration. I opened it standing right there on the sidewalk, cold air slicing through my jacket. It was a wedding invitation. Not for me, not mentioning me. Addressed to my building's unit, but listing Darlene and Leonard Parks as the honored guests. I stared at the cardstock, feeling the foundation of my carefully rebuilt life tilt again. They hadn't just broken into my home. They had used my address as if it were still theirs, as if I was still their reluctant, silent possession. I clutched the invitation tighter, my breath puffing out in shaky clouds. It wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't an accident. It was a reminder, a declaration that no matter what I built in their eyes, I was still nothing more than an extension of them, a forgotten shadow. I dropped the invitation into the nearest trash bin without looking back. That night, restless and bitter, I scrolled through social media. At first, it was just mindless scrolling, friends' kids in Halloween costumes, coworkers posting about holiday travel, and then I saw it. A tag from someone I barely remembered from childhood, a family reunion. Faces I hadn't seen in years laughing under twinkling lights strung across someone's backyard. Long tables filled with food, glasses raised in toasts, Even distant cousins I hadn't thought of in decades were there. Everyone but me. My absence wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate. I wasn't lost to them. I had been erased. The realization punched the air from my lungs. For a long time, I just sat there, the blue glow of the screen painting my empty living room in cold light. The memories I had spent so long trying to box away came flooding back. Birthdays no one celebrated, school plays where no one came, silent dinners where my voice felt like an intrusion. I remembered standing awkwardly at the edge of every family photo, half hoping someone would pull me closer. No one ever did. Back then, I told myself it was my fault, that if I were better, prettier, smarter, quieter, they would love me the way they loved each other. Now, staring at their smiling faces on the screen, I finally understood. I had never been part of the picture. I had merely been tolerated until I was gone. I closed the laptop slowly, my own reflection flickering in the dark screen. Maybe survival wasn't about holding on to the hope of being welcomed back. Maybe survival meant accepting that, sometimes, the door you keep knocking on will never open. And maybe that was okay. The first cold snap of November swept through Portland, leaving a brittle chill in the air and a film of frost on the windows each morning. I kept busy, filling my days with calls to contractors and meetings with tenants, trying to pretend everything was normal. I pretended so hard I almost believed it. Until I picked up my phone and saw the notification. Darlene Parks had tagged me in a Facebook post. My heart kicked in my chest. Against my better judgment, I tapped to open it. There it was, laid out for the world to see. A carefully crafted narrative, dripping with venom disguised as heartbreak. A series of photos of my parents sitting alone at a diner, accompanied by a caption that made my stomach turn. Our daughter abandoned us. After everything we sacrificed, she left us to grow old and sick alone. We pray for her to remember where she came from, before it's too late. Hundreds of comments flooded in, sympathy pouring out for them from people who didn't know a single truth of what had happened behind closed doors. A few names from my past, old classmates, distant relatives, had chimed in too, some with condolences, some with thinly veiled judgment. I could barely breathe. It was one thing to fight battles behind closed doors. It was another to be dragged into the public square and made the villain in someone else's morality play. I threw my phone onto the couch and paced the living room, my mind a hurricane. Every step I had taken to build a new life felt suddenly fragile, a glass house bracing against stones. And it didn't take long for the cracks to show. Within days, one of my longest-standing tenants gave notice to vacate. He was polite about it. Too polite. Said he needed to move closer to work, that it wasn't personal. But the way he wouldn't meet my eyes told me everything I needed to know. The damage wasn't just emotional anymore. It was financial. It was survival. I sat at my kitchen table that night, a stack of unpaid maintenance bills spread out before me. The numbers swam on the page. Rent loss, repair costs, legal fees already stacking up from the identity theft mess. I wasn't just fighting for my peace anymore. I was fighting to keep my life from collapsing entirely. And for a moment, just a moment, I doubted everything. Was I wrong? Had I been selfish? Was surviving worth becoming the villain in everyone else's eyes? I closed my eyes and let the memories surface. Walking home from school with bruises hidden under baggy sweatshirts, the way my mother's voice could cut deeper than any slap, the cold, relentless indifference of my father's silence. They hadn't raised me. They had survived me, and now they wanted to rewrite history. I opened my laptop and pulled up my financial records, cold dread seeping into my bones. One more tenant lost, one more leak in the roof, one more public smear, and everything I had fought for could slip away. They weren't just trying to hurt me. They wanted to erase me piece by piece until there was nothing left. The days blurred together after the Facebook post and the first tenant's departure. I moved like a ghost through the building, checking locks, testing alarms, triple-checking windows. I told myself it was just precaution, just being responsible. But deep down, I knew. It was fear. It was anger. It was the quiet, sharp edge of survival instincts finally waking up. Mid-November in Portland wasn't kind. The rain was relentless, slapping the windows with thin, cold fingers. On a particularly raw afternoon, I walked the property again, clipboard in hand, pretending everything was fine. That's when I saw them. Two men in navy jackets, tool belts slung low, moving through the building's main hallway like they belonged there. Except I hadn't hired any electricians. My stomach turned to stone. I approached, keeping my voice calm. "Can I see some ID?" I asked. One of them smiled, too easily, and patted his pockets. "Forgot it in the truck," he said, backing toward the exit. The other just shrugged and kept moving, heading toward the stairwell. Everything inside me screamed danger. I stepped between him and the stairs, heart hammering against my ribs. "Now!" He paused for a beat too long before brushing past me and out the door, muttering something I couldn't hear over the roar in my ears. The second man followed, smirking. By the time I reached the parking lot, they were gone. Panic boiled over into something sharper, something clearer. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was infiltration. I changed the locks again that night, even though my hands trembled so badly I dropped the screwdriver twice. I installed a second security camera facing the back lot. I slept with my phone on the pillow beside me, fully clothed. But the damage had already been done. A few days later, the power in 3 units went out. An emergency electrician, this time one I hired myself, found the tampering. Wires stripped, junction boxes forced open, damage so deliberate it might as well have been signed. The repair estimate made my stomach cramp. Thousands of dollars I didn't have. Thousands of dollars ripped straight from the fragile foundation I'd built my life on. I stood in the mechanical room after the electrician left, the smell of burnt plastic and damp concrete thick in the air. My hands curled into fists so tight my nails bit into my palms. They weren't just trying to scare me, they were trying to destroy me. For the first time in weeks, the fear cracked apart, leaving something fiercer underneath, something harder. I drove straight to the police station. Filing the report didn't erase the shaking in my hands or the way my heart galloped against my ribs, but it helped. A little. Enough. I wasn't going to survive this by shrinking myself down to fit inside their twisted version of family loyalty. Not this time. Later that night, sitting cross-legged on my living room floor with the legal papers spread around me like a broken city, I picked up my phone. My lawyer answered on the second ring. "I'm ready," I said. My voice was steady now, anchored by something deeper than fear. "I'm not surviving this. I'm fighting back." The air was sharp with the scent of rain-soaked concrete as I made my usual rounds that morning. My keys jingled in my hand, a small, familiar sound against the oppressive silence of the hallways. The weight of everything that had happened pressed between my shoulder blades, but I pushed it down, focusing on the checklist I carried like armor. Unit 103 had been vacant for weeks, waiting for minor repairs to finish before it could be rented out again. As I approached the door, a flicker of movement inside caught my eye. The lock changed. The number plaque scratched and faded. A folded note taped crookedly to the door read, "We are home where we belong." My stomach hollowed out. I gripped the doorknob, heart hammering, but I didn't go inside. I already knew what I would find. My parents had moved in, uninvited, unapologetic, claiming my work, my safety, my home as theirs. For a moment, white-hot rage blurred my vision. I wanted to kick the door down, to scream until the walls shook. But instead, I stepped back, pulled out my phone, and called my lawyer. It took every ounce of restraint I had to follow the legal process. Notice of trespassing, formal eviction papers, when every part of me screamed for immediate action. But even then, even doing everything by the book, it wasn't enough. When the officers arrived to serve the papers, my mother stumbled theatrically out of the apartment, clutching her hip and crying out like a wounded animal. Her voice rang shrill down the hallways, drawing tenants out of their apartments like spectators to a public shaming. "She pushed me," she wailed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "My own daughter!" The officers looked at me, then at the security camera mounted just above the stairwell. "Stay calm," one of them said, as if sensing the storm crackling just beneath my skin. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I pulled up the footage on my phone, the one that showed me standing 5 feet away the entire time, arms crossed, not even moving when my mother threw herself dramatically to the floor. The lie evaporated in real time, leaving only an uncomfortable silence behind. My parents glared at me with something close to hatred. Not shame, not regret, hatred. It was the moment I realized, truly, finally, that there was no line they wouldn't cross. No lie too big, no act too low. I watched them escorted back into the unit temporarily, pending formal proceedings. My mother clutched her side, still performing, but the audience had already dispersed. Standing there, I felt something inside me snap. Not a clean break, but a slow, grinding shift, like a glacier finally cracking under its own weight. There was no family left to save. There were no ties left to honor. Survival wasn't enough anymore. I clutched the eviction notice in one hand, my lawyer's number pulled up on my phone in the other. They wanted a war. I would give them one. The halls that once felt familiar now echoed with something colder, something sharp. I caught the glances from the tenants, quick, sharp cuts of the eye when they thought I wasn't looking. Whispers floated like smoke through the corridors. She threw them out, her own parents. They're elderly, aren't they? How could she? I didn't need to hear every word to understand. My home, once my sanctuary, had turned into a maze of judgments and muttered accusations. Each step I took down those hallways felt heavier, like wading through quicksand I couldn't escape. I smiled politely when I passed them, a tight, brittle smile that cracked at the edges. I signed maintenance forms, answered complaints, fixed what needed fixing, but the tension was a living thing, pressing against the walls, against my chest. Then came the signs. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. The small gathering at the curb, the woman with a bright red poster, then another joined, and another. Protect our elders, family first. The slogans screamed silently against the winter air, bold against the gray skies of Portland. I watched from my second-floor window as the group grew, bundled against the cold, voices rising just enough to carry. A few carried photos, grainy images of my parents looking tired and frail. None of them knew the truth. None of them cared. All that mattered was the story my parents had spun, one where I was the heartless daughter who abandoned blood for pride. My phone buzzed with messages, questions from tenants, passive-aggressive reminders about lease agreements, subtle hints about reputational risks. It wasn't just whispers anymore, it was siege. I felt it chipping away at me, layer by layer. The loneliness, the shame, the anger coiling tighter and tighter, a spring wound too far. I thought about locking my doors and hiding, letting it blow over, letting them win. But I remembered the way my mother looked at me when she was escorted out of my building, triumphant, like she knew I'd crumble under the weight of public scorn. I turned from the window. Enough. I picked up my phone and dialed my attorney's private line. He answered on the first ring, his voice a steady anchor. "I'm done playing defense," I said quietly. "It's time to fight." They wanted a villain. I would show them just how ruthless a villain could be. The courthouse smelled like old paper and rain-soaked carpet. I stood just inside the main doors for a moment, letting the cold air settle around me, steeling myself for what waited down the hall. The crowd wasn't large, but it was enough. Faces I didn't recognize, but who would later have opinions about me anyway, whispering behind their hands, nudging each other whenever I shifted my weight or adjusted my jacket. A few journalists hovered like vultures outside the glass walls, their breath fogging up the surface as they waited for the blood to hit the floor. I had thought I would feel strong, marching into this place. Instead, I felt brittle, like one wrong word could shatter everything I had fought so hard to rebuild. When they called my case, I followed my lawyer to the defendant's table, heart hammering against my ribs. Across the room, Darlene sat with Leonard by her side, their faces painted in perfect tragedy, and then she took the stand. Darlene's voice broke before she even finished stating her name. Tears shimmered on cue, running tracks through makeup that had been too carefully applied to be an accident. "She was our only daughter," she sobbed, wringing a tissue until it tore apart in her hands. "We sacrificed everything for her, and when we needed her most, she threw us away like garbage." I didn't move, didn't blink, because if I did, I might scream. Leonard stayed silent, every heavy breath from him another layer of guilt the courtroom was eager to drape across my shoulders. When it was my turn, I stood, legs like stone pillars barely holding me up, and spoke the truth. Every word tasted like ash. It didn't matter. I could feel the weight of their story pressing down harder than mine could ever push back. Later, after the session adjourned for the day, I walked out under a sky smeared with gray. The cameras were waiting, microphones shoved toward my face. I didn't stop. I didn't answer. But behind me, Darlene's lawyer held a press conference. Sound bites spilled into the evening news within hours. The daughter who betrayed her aging parents. The heartless woman who left her family to rot. I sat alone in my apartment, lights off, listening to my own name curdling in strangers' mouths on the evening broadcast. For a long time, I didn't move. Grief twisted in my chest. Grief not for them, but for the version of me who once thought that love could fix anything if I just tried hard enough. I stared down at the court documents spread out on my kitchen table, hands trembling. They ended this chapter. I would write the next one. The courthouse steps were slick with freezing rain, and the crowd that had once gathered to gawk had thinned to a few scattered umbrellas and tired reporters scribbling the day's defeats into their notepads. I stood there for a long moment, the final papers clutched in my gloved hands, letting the cold seep deep into my bones. It was over. At least, that's what the judge said. The verdict fell in my favor, the lawsuit dismissed, my rights reaffirmed. But standing on the courthouse steps, I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow. Inside the courtroom, the air had been thick with muted murmurs and shuffling papers. I had signed my name on the final documents with a hand that barely trembled, the pen carving shallow grooves into the thick legal sheets. Winning hadn't erased anything. It hadn't stitched the torn edges of my family back together. It hadn't filled the empty spaces carved out of me over years of quiet cruelty. It was just over, for now. I made it home before the real storm hit. Thunder cracked somewhere over the hills as I peeled off my wet coat and tossed it onto the entryway bench. The apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and old wood, grounding me in the smallest way. I hadn't even kicked off my shoes before my phone buzzed on the counter. It was my lawyer. I knew before I answered. "They filed a new suit," he said, voice tight with the kind of anger reserved for things you can't quite punch. "Emotional damages, civil claim, total nonsense, but it'll still need to be addressed." I laughed then. Not a real laugh. Not the kind that bubbles up from somewhere light and human. It was sharp, broken. I leaned against the counter, feeling the weight of the world shift slightly, just enough to remind me it hadn't finished crushing me yet. They wouldn't stop, because they didn't know how. But for the first time, the thought didn't terrify me. It didn't even surprise me. It just was. Later, I stood at my window, watching kids below build lopsided snowmen, their shrieks of laughter rising up through the brittle air. I thought about everything I had lost, everything I had fought for, everything they had tried and failed to take. The next lawsuit would come. Maybe another after that. Maybe they would chase me until the end of my days. But they wouldn't own me anymore. Not my future, not my peace, not my story. I wasn't surviving them. I was moving beyond them. Maybe they'll chase me forever. Maybe they'll haunt every chapter I write. But this story, this ending, it belongs to me now. Life doesn't always hand us the endings we expect. Sometimes survival isn't about winning battles or earning validation. It's about knowing when to walk away and choosing peace over chaos. I learned that no matter how hard you try, some people will rewrite your story to suit their needs. But that doesn't mean you have to live inside their version of you. We each have the power to decide who we become, even when the world insists on seeing us through the wrong lens. Healing doesn't come from proving others wrong. It comes from building a life where their approval doesn't matter. What about you? Have you ever had to walk away from people you thought would always be there? How did you find your peace? If this story touched your heart or made you think, leave a comment with the number 1 inch or tell me where you're watching from. And if you didn't quite connect with it, I'd love to hear why. Every voice matters here. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you want more real stories that speak to the strength inside us all. Thank you for being here.